Excellent. Okay, everybody, welcome to our second Frontiers event. We're very excited to have you here. This is a series where we bring top researchers and engineers who are working at the cutting edge of various fields to speak a little bit about their research with the Manifold community. For this talk, our speaker will be Langdon Holmes. He's a Ph.D. student at Vanderbilt University, specializing in language learning and educational technology. His research focuses on learner language development, learning analytics, and open science, and his master's thesis explored non-adjacent word combinations known as collocations. He's also part of the learning analytics team at the National Institute for Adult Learning and Online Education, AI-ALOE. Langdon, if you would please.
All right. Thank you, Sid. As Sid said, my name's Langdon, and I'm going to be talking about de-identification of student writing. This is a problem we face in the field of learning analytics. There are a lot of platforms that collect huge amounts of student data that would be valuable to researchers, but that data can't be shared for the most part because it would violate student privacy. And one of the most difficult types of data to de-identify is student writing. So this talk will cover some of the approaches that we've taken to address this problem and to encourage other folks to get involved in tackling this problem and hopefully making more data open and available for research while protecting student privacy. There we go. So talk's laid out in 6 parts. First, we'll talk about student privacy and privacy generally, what it means, what are some modern theories about privacy and what it means to violate privacy. Then we'll talk about de-identification, contrasting it with anonymization, which is a more stringent approach to protecting privacy. Then I'll introduce the data set that will be used in the later studies. And we'll briefly cover a quick study we did, an initial attempt to de-identify this data automatically. Then I'll go over Pillow, which is an approach we used to de-identify the data, taking a closer look at how identifiers are obfuscated. And we'll take a look at, we'll talk a little bit more about what that means to obfuscate identifiers. And then finally, I will talk about CRAPI, which is a data set we developed. It's the cleaned repository of annotated PII. We had some fun with the name. And this is a large-scale public data set that contains student identifiers. And we used this to host a Kaggle competition in an effort to draw attention to this problem and set up some benchmarks for automated de-identification performance. Very cool. So what is privacy? The dominant framework for thinking about privacy currently is called contextual integrity. This was developed by Nissenbaum across a few publications. And the core idea here is that privacy is defined in terms of how information flows between parties, and importantly, the expectations that the data subject has about how their information will be used, with whom it will be shared. And an idea here is that every social situation has a context with certain norms, values, and expectations. And when information flows in a way that violates those norms, that's when a privacy violation occurs. Or when the data is used for a purpose that's not known to the data subject or seems unexpected. And a sort of a consequence of this is that data isn't inherently sensitive or private. Privacy violations occur when data flows inappropriately. And you can think about if you share medical information with your doctor, it's not private in that context, but it would be a privacy violation if your doctor shared that with other people, right? In the context of student privacy, one framework that's been developed is called intellectual privacy. And this is built on top of the contextual integrity framework and sort of thinks about what the context is in a university setting. So the argument goes like this, that one of the purposes of a university is to provide students with a space to develop their ideas without fear of public scrutiny. And if students' ideas were publicly shared or shared with parties who they aren't comfortable with, then they could feel scrutinized or embarrassed about those ideas. And an important sort of consequence of this thinking is that students could have their intellectual privacy jeopardized, even if their ideas are not attributable to the student. So I could write something that's a little bit half-baked, and if those ideas were shared, even if you couldn't tell that I was the one who wrote them, that could jeopardize sort of the learning environment that universities try to foster. Some other important kind of footnotes on this is that students generally value research into improving educational outcomes, learning analytics broadly, but they consider consent to be important. And that makes sense, right? They're accustomed to providing consent when research is being conducted on their data. However, a concern with the consent model is that not all student demographics are equally likely to provide consent. And this has major implications for the research that we conduct and any interventions or treatments that we develop based on that research. If all student demographics aren't equally represented in the data, then our interventions could end up benefiting different groups differentially or even harming certain groups. So consent isn't the end-all be-all solution for protecting privacy, but it certainly plays a role depending on the context and the data use. So yes, privacy is complicated. That's what these slides are supposed to show. And before we move on, I just want to talk about two important legal standards. On the left-hand side, you see a little excerpt from HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And this lays out some guidelines for de-identification. It lists, I believe it's 19 types of identifiers. And as long as those identifiers are removed from a document that a hospital might have or an insurance company might have, then it's no longer considered private health information. That's de-identification. You get rid of the names, the codes, email addresses, etc. And then it's no longer considered private. Now, that's an incomplete solution because even if those things are removed, you can't guarantee that the data subject or the patient is not identifiable. FERPA takes a less clearly defined, more stringent approach, which is called anonymization. And in this case, you have to not just remove a specific set of identifiers, but clean the data such that the participant, the data subject, or in this case, the student, cannot be re-identified. And then at the end there, it says, and taking into account other reasonably available information, which might include things like a phone book or a Google search. And that's a lot less clearly defined, and it can be difficult to figure out just how much information needs to be removed. But these are two approaches to protecting privacy. And for the rest of the talk, I will be focusing on de-identification, which would not meet FERPA standards in all cases where FERPA applies. So we talked about anonymization and de-identification. There are two types of PII. We can broadly separate them into direct identifiers and indirect identifiers. Direct identifier can independently and uniquely identify a data subject. This would be something like an email address, phone number, or a student ID number, and the institution that ID number is associated with. Whereas indirect identifiers can't uniquely and independently identify a subject, but in combination, they might be able to. So if you combine someone's gender, birthday, city, and maybe their employer, then if you were determined enough, you could probably figure out who that person is. And then lastly, we'll talk about this towards the end. Surrogate identifiers are a replacement for an original identifier that has the same shape as the original identifier. For example, if it's someone's name, you would replace it with a different name. And then that is no longer identifying that the specific subject. And that relates to the obfuscation strategies that we'll talk about later. Just a quick overview of some important types of PII, which is personally identifiable information. And these are roughly structured from most identifying to least. So on the upper end of the spectrum with direct identifiers, you have unique IDs like emails and usernames. And in student writing, you get things like Facebook usernames or Instagram handles. And the names are a little bit less identifying than that. So oftentimes names are shared between multiple people. And that's especially true if you're looking at a partial name like John or something. But we still treat them as direct identifiers because in some cases they can be uniquely identifying. And then on the lower end of the scale, we have affiliations. In our case, we're working with students, so their school or their employer. And then on the bottom, we have attributes like gender, nationality, city, and age. Other things like birthday would also be in this category. So the first step towards building an automated de-identification system or setting up the task is to manually label some data using humans. And that typically works with an interface like this, where you highlight the text and then choose the label. Once you have that labeled data, a common way to structure it is using this, it's a tabular format, even though it doesn't quite look like a table, where you have each row is a single token. And then the first column is the text for that token. And the second column is the label. And in this case, most tokens are going to be labeled O for outer or outside, at least in the bio scheme, which means that it's not identifying. Tokens that are identifying will have the specific label, the type of identifier that they are. And in some cases, you'll have Del Bosque, for example, in the bottom. Those are two parts of a single person's name. And because those are two tokens, we have little prefixes to indicate what's the beginning and what's a continuation or an inner of that label. And that helps to delineate when there are two adjacent identifiers of the same type. In our experience, that doesn't happen very often, but it's a good precaution to make sure that you can reproduce the original labels based on the data format. And yeah, as you can probably see at this point, you can set that up as a supervised learning problem. So some quick background research in the area. There's been excellent success in the medical field, which is unsurprising given the legal standards and just the amount of research that's conducted in the medical field. And generally, we're looking at about 95% recall of identifiers in medical data of various types. The Stanford de-identifier is an excellent example. It's open source. It was trained exclusively on radiology reports, but in our testing, it actually generalizes fairly well, even to student writing, and probably to other forms of medical documents as well. And there's some proprietary systems with similar performance. There's limited success in student writing, but also just less work that's been done. One example is Bosch et al., and they did achieve 95% a recall of student names in discussion posts, but there's the caveat that they defined all names as student names out of an abundance of caution, which really takes the task out of a de-identification realm and into a named entity recognition realm, where you're just finding all of the person names. And at least my perspective is that we have great models and great approaches for labeling person names. And the disadvantage of that approach is that you lose things like references and citations, which could be important in student writing, or you could have another form of student writing that takes a narrative structure. And then you might want to preserve character names, or at least make sure the character names are consistent throughout the text. So some promising work, but also some more work to be done, which is where we come in. This is the student writing data set that we put together This is our first pass. I'm just going to talk about the source, and the data set changes a little bit as we go through our various projects, and I'll try to make that clear. But it comes from a Coursera course that was titled Design Thinking for Innovation, and there were about 400,000 students enrolled when we collected this data. The grade for the course was solely based on a single assignment, which was peer-reviewed. There's also a discussion forum and clickstream data, which we won't be talking about today. That assignment looked something like this. This is the example that was given to students, and it was structured in 6 sections, and some of those sections were combined here. Challenge and selection are combined. And it was submitted as a PDF, but a successful submission tended to be about 2 pages. And it asked students to apply one of the design thinking concepts that they learned about in the course to some problem they're familiar with in their jobs or in their lives. The reality, this was an open enrollment course. Students submitted handwritten assignments. You can see some PII is blacked out there. There were plagiarized assignments. These were each 80-page documents that were almost certainly not written by the students who submitted them. And then we just got some weird stuff. So we needed to deal with the messiness that should be expected in a massively open online course. I really enjoyed the ice cream treat submission. That made me smile. So a first stab at sort of cleaning up this data is first finding out how many submissions there were, then selecting those that were graded, unique to the user, and had a valid download URL. And then we took some more aggressive cleaning steps, parsed to English, at least 50 words in less than 5 pages. And if it's not clear here, we used an automatic PDF parsing solution. This was a few years ago. There are probably some better ones out there now. We use PyMu PDF. And then less than 5 pages, that was put into place because some students submitted slide decks rather than sort of a prose essay form, which is just sort of a different type of data, a different genre. Okay, now we're jumping straight to Pillow, which is the obfuscation, the system for PII labeling and obfuscation that we developed. And the idea here is that we know we can achieve decent recall or accuracy when we're working with automated PII labeling systems, but we can't reach perfect labeling accuracy. So we're trying to look at the obfuscation side of things, which is how we replace the identifier, to see if we can provide some additional privacy guarantees on that end of things, maybe compensating for the less than perfect recall that we see in automatic systems. And what that looks like is this. So when we're obfuscating names, let's say that our system fails to correctly label the name Zhangzhu in this text. If we take a standard approach to obfuscation, which would just be replacing the name with a pseudonym like student name, maybe with brackets around it, then it becomes very obvious when there's a leaked identifier because there's a student name that remains in the text. However, if we replace all the correctly labeled names with a different name that we generate automatically, then it becomes really hard to tell which one of those might be leaked or if any of them are leaked. That's the basic idea. Now, actually, replacing names is a bit of a challenge because names contain a lot of information about the person's gender, nationality, and even if you want to get into it, maybe their economic standing or their age. Names go through trends over time, etc. We took a fairly simple approach that works surprisingly well, considering how simple it is, although there's certainly room for improvement here. And the basic idea is to split the name into a first and last name, which can be quite challenging when you have middle names to worry about, maybe titles, and just other factors that can make it difficult to split a name. And then using the first name, we try to match gender, and using the last name, we try to match country. And then using a large data set of names with gender and country information, we sample matching gender and country there. So there's a lot of probabilities involved here. So we're not always matching the gender, like, let's say the name is John. We're going to match another name that's most likely a man's name, but it could also be a woman's name, something like Sam, for example. So there's still a lot of variability in the way in our strategy for generating these names. Anyway, we combine them, and then what we get out is a name that hopefully roughly matches the original name, and we can use that to obfuscate the text. And you can see the original was by Abdul Ansari, and the obfuscated version is by Tarek Ahmad. Now, what does that look like? First, I should have mentioned this, we trained a model, a transformer-based model to de-identify text. This was based on Longformer. And we compared it to Spacey Large, which is a named entity recognition model. And that just looks for person names, not student names in particular. So what we would expect is that the precision would be lower, but the recall should be on par, maybe even higher. And yes. And then the Stanford de-identifier, which I mentioned before, and we just mapped the patient labels to student names, just as a comparison for performance. And we see that Pillow performs quite a bit better on in-domain data. So this is, it was trained on data from Coursera and tested on that data. So we would expect it to perform better, but this is still encouraging. Then we took a new data set of forum discussion posts from a course at Georgia Tech. And Pillow did not perform quite as well in terms of recall. It still has higher precision, which makes sense because it's trained to differentiate between student names and other types of names. But the performance was a little bit lower, which does indicate that we need more diverse training data for our model. And then we introduced a new approach to evaluate the obfuscation strategies. So we obfuscated all of these using Pillow, replacing names with surrogate identifiers. And then we enlisted 2 attackers to look at all of the obfuscated documents and try to identify which names might be leaked. And they had fairly low recall, less than 25% recall, and precision a little over 50% precision. And the takeaway here is that they missed most leaked identifiers. And even when they did correctly re-identify a student, they had a much lower confidence about that as a result of the obfuscation strategy. So we see this as encouraging evidence that a de-identification system with less than perfect recall of identifiers could still be effective in practice if it's paired with an obfuscation strategy like this, where you use surrogate identifiers. Okay, and now we're gonna talk about basically our efforts to improve things on the labeling side by crowdsourcing model developments. So there were some issues with the data set that became apparent as we were working with it. There were quite a few near duplicate documents, not perfect duplicates, those are easy to identify, but close enough where students submitted very similar, probably plagiarized submissions. And then we also had some issues with our PDF parsing process. For example, all of the IO digraphs replaced with 3, like creation as in create 3N. But there were diverse errors that if it was just that error, we could have fixed it manually. And so I'll briefly talk about some approaches to fixing those issues from a data cleaning perspective. And these approaches are based on the document term matrix, which is a fun technique in natural language processing. Still comes in handy, even though we have transformers now. And it's basically set up where you have each column is a term and each row is a document. And the advantage here is that you've taken an unstructured text and you've imposed a structure on it. Now it's a matrix, which you can do all kinds of statistics on. It's a very powerful approach. The cons are that you're destroying sequence information. It tends to be very high dimensional, which means there are a lot of terms, typically tens of thousands, if not more. And so you can use some strategies to reduce the dimensionality of the matrix. And another downside is that it's very, very sparse, which does place some limitations on what statistical techniques you can use. And by sparse, I mean that at any given combination of term and document, it's probably a 0, because that term does not appear in that document. So for removing near duplicate documents, we found some research on containment score, which looks at the overlap in trigrams between two documents. This works really well for plagiarism, especially light plagiarism, where a student modifies the ideas, but clearly took most of the structure from another source. Unfortunately, we're looking at all pairwise comparisons between about 20,000 documents, which is fairly computationally expensive. So we made a compromise and used cosine similarity, which you can express as a matrix multiplication problem. So it's still technically all pairwise comparisons, but you can compute it much more efficiently. Now, what we ended up doing is removing all documents that had a similarity with any other document of 0.9 or above. This meant about 6,000 documents were removed, which is quite a bit. Oh, I think there's an error there. It should be 600. I'll have to double check that. Now, to remove the character encoding errors that I mentioned earlier, we developed a fairly novel approach where we set up that document term matrix, but instead of having words as your terms, you have characters. And in this case, it's not sparse, right? Because most characters appear in most documents. And then we took a look at a few anomaly detection algorithms. And you can imagine that if every IO digraph is replaced with a 3, then that document would have strangely low counts for I and O and strangely high counts for 3. And so we sort of used that reasoning and tried a few different methods. We settled on a minimum volume ellipsoid, which takes this high dimensional space, draws an ellipsoid with the smallest volume that contains a specified amount of the data. And we played with that value and selected a value that excluded consistently poorly encoded documents. And this ended up removing about 800. There's an ellipse, you can imagine a 4-dimensional ellipse there. Okay, now we went about re-annotating the documents. We were able to get about 83% agreement across all PII types, which is quite good for a complex annotation task like this. We had a single adjudicator resolve all disagreements, and we had stronger annotation guidelines. I didn't define all the types, but here they are. You can see we had location was the most frequent. Bit of a mistake there. Location included things like city, country, as well as nationality. So sort of a mix of usages under that label. The name student was the second most frequent. And for the Kaggle competition, which I will talk about in a moment, we just focused on the direct identifiers, which present the greatest privacy risk and are also the most well-defined. Here's some more statistics about the counts of PII and how they were distributed across the data set. I'm going to fly through this a little bit, but I will highlight the second graph here shows how many names that are not PII are in each document. So a major challenge with this approach is not just identifying names, but identifying which names could reveal a student's identity that we want to protect. And in that way, we can preserve names that might be useful for research, such as references or character names. Now, we use different obfuscation strategies for each type of PII. So first we had another category, which I had to manually obfuscate. Then we used the pillow strategy for names. And then for some indirect identifiers, we just shuffled them. So if one student said they lived in Mexico and another student said they lived in Taiwan, we might just swap those. And that way we kind of preserve the distribution in the data set while also nullifying the re-identification potential of those identifiers. We also randomized high entropy identifiers, things like dates, ID numbers, and we used a special strategy for social media URLs, which were relatively common in this data set. So there's only one part of the YouTube URL that might identify, well, that identifies which video it is. And so we just scrambled that part while still making it clear that, hey, this is a YouTube video that might help with the reading of the text. Similarly for Facebook and a few other social media sites. For the remaining types of URLs, we just procedurally generated them. They have a pretty strict structure, and we used a tool called Faker to generate those. Data science competition. First thing for a competition is the metric. We used an F beta or an F5 metric. If you're not familiar, F beta, well, F1 is the harmonic mean of precision and recall. F5 is a similar metric, but it weights recall as 5 times more important than precision. And this makes sense because it's more important to correctly label student identities than it is to preserve other information in the data like references. So we chose a value of 5 there. We also had an efficiency track, which is a modification of this metric that of the F5 metric that rewards lower processing time. And this is meant to encourage solutions that could be run on people's private computers, don't need a GPU or a high performance machine. We had great participation, over 10,000 entrants, 2,000 teams, and this was the prize money distribution. And we reserved almost a little over half of the data for the private leaderboard, which is just the test set. And that was because there was low representation of some labels in the data, and we really needed most of the data for evaluation. And as a benefit, this also encouraged competitors to augment the training data using their own means, and that was fairly insightful. And I'll just talk a little bit about how that went. First, the main results were an F5 of 0.97, which is excellent. And in the efficiency track, the top performer with the efficiency metric had an F5 of 0.94, which is very close. We're happy about that. So some insights from the competition, and I'm excited to share this because I think some of these are larger trends in the space of using transformers for different types of tasks. So first of all, encoder-only transformers were basically the only solution used for the actual labeling model. The DeBerta version 3 series, which was produced by Microsoft a few years ago, is consistently the best performer in a wide variety of data science competitions involving unstructured text. Decoder-only LLMs, things like GPT and Llama, were extremely useful in generating additional labeled training data. And yeah, so an example of data augmentation, this was very successful. Competitors shared their synthetic data sets that they used for training, and that was a very effective strategy. Some not so good news is that the efficiency track relied on specifics of our data set. We had a fairly homogeneous data set, one assignment, one course. And it was fairly easy to find sort of quirks of this data set that wouldn't generalize to other forms of student writing. So we sort of expected that. It's a bit of a bummer. A nice strategy from the efficiency track is that they found a lot of success with pre-filtering documents. So you can use a lightweight approach to determine if a document definitely doesn't have identifiers, and then you don't need to do any intensive processing on that document. And you can save quite a bit of processing time that way. So it's sort of a two-tiered approach. Do a quick pass to see if it might have PII, and then do a deep dive on something like 20 or 30% of the documents to identify what that PII is. Future directions, we want to make Pillow more accessible. We want a user-friendly Python package. We want to talk about, or we want to think about how we can improve obfuscation, maybe using generative LLMs to create surrogate identifiers. We'd like to develop more diverse data sets. And this is kind of a small point, but an identity-based evaluation metric would also be a boom. So we have a token-based metric, but de-identifying a student's name when it appears in one place doesn't do any good if that identity is still revealed by another occurrence. So working on the evaluation metric there might be a good thing. And thank you so much. These are my collaborators, and thank you to the Learning Agency for funding the data science competition. And looks like we have plenty of time for questions. And yeah, thanks again.
Langdon, thank you for this excellent talk. As you mentioned, the floor is now open for questions. Let me unmute. Okay. If anybody has any questions, feel free to unmute. If not, I have a question that we can start with.
Oh, hey,
Okay.
Landon.
Oh,
sorry, I was gonna.
Hi.
Hi. I have thanks for the talk. I had a question about how did you deal with the fact that there would be other names besides student names, and therefore you had to make sure that you didn't obfuscate those names and only the student names.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's mostly handled at the stage where we are manually labeling the data. We have annotation guidelines that specifically say only the names should be labeled. And then from there, it's just a matter of training your models to reproduce the labeled data, if that makes sense. So the models have access in their training data to which names are student names and which ones are not. In terms of how the models do that, that's an XAI question. I'm not sure I can really answer that one.
Yeah, I was curious because I was like, oh, I don't know how generalizable that would be, right? If given another paper, who knows?
Yeah, I don't have a hard answer for that part of the question, but I would, in my experience, fine-tuned transformers tend to be fairly generalizable. They learn general principles. We did some previous work that I didn't cover where we used a rule-based system to try to label student names, and it had mediocre performance. And I think what we also saw with the efficiency track is that more rule-based systems seem to be less generalizable because they take advantage of specifics of the data set. Whereas I think an embedding-based model, like a fine-tuned DeBerta model, could generalize better to different data sets. But that's testable.
Langdon, this was really cool. Thank you for sharing. It was great to see how the work has also progressed since we used to work more closely on it. On the identity-based metric, that has me thinking. So, is there any I don't know how far you guys have gotten in thinking about that. Are there any sort of representative approaches for that kind of thing in other PII removal literature or anything like that?
Not that I've seen. I think I have seen. I can try to find you the source. I think I have seen it mentioned. But I'm not sure I've seen anyone use it. It should be fairly simple, where you could still use an F beta metric, right? But instead of counting each token that's correctly labeled as a true positive, you would count each identity that is fully correctly labeled as a true positive.
I
So you
see.
can still use an F beta there. It's a relatively small adjustment, but you could also try to get more sophisticated with it, maybe have a weighted combination of the two.
Yeah, makes sense. Interesting.
Langdon, I had a question about the hiding in plain sight strategy. I thought that was really cool, but I imagine the more unique someone's name is, the more difficult it might be to obfuscate that, right? If that's missed by the classifier. Was there any correlation there that you guys saw in the red team attacks?
Yeah, not that we saw. So, okay, if someone's name is, if the original name is unique, then chances are the replacement will be less unique. but I'm not sure if that's a problem for. I guess maybe the thinking there would be that I don't think that could be useful in terms of figuring out which identifiers have been leaked, because the way we sample it, we sample in a weighted fashion. So let's say the name Langdon has a frequency of 0.01% in the US, and the tool correctly finds out that I'm a male in the US. It will have a 0.01% chance of pulling the name Langdon, which also reflects the chances of seeing that name in the real data. So our source, which I didn't mention for these names, is a leaked data set from Facebook. So Facebook leaked a bunch of names with genders and country codes, and it was a real boon for this very specific application. And that data's not harmful to anyone, it's just names. But it is very useful to have a accurate measure of how names are distributed across places. And so yeah, that was useful. Does that kind of, is that what you're asking
Yeah,
about?
that answers half the question, but I was also wondering about the other case, because you were mentioning there are times where the identifier fails to identify the name, and so the strategy is to change the other names so you can't tell which one is changed and which one is personally identifiable. So I was wondering about that case where the name has been the name was failed to be changed, and so maybe it's easier to remember somebody with a very unique name compared to like a John Smith. Not picking on any John Smiths.
I think the interesting thing here though is that, so based on what Langdon was just saying, the distribution is as close to the distribution of names that would occur in that as possible, right? So like it's basically like the occurrence rates of, you know, quote unquote like rarer names, right? Lower probability names won't change in the distribution. So you won't actually be able to tell which is which. You'll just be picking up on red herrings also, right? If that's the case. Now there's like this idea of like, what if this is interesting, Langdon. What if somebody brute forces by picking all the least, they might have some insight that like somebody's using a method like this, especially now that, we're talking about this as an actual approach. So, what if you brute force all the low probability names? I wonder if the surface of attack increases at all by just selectively targeting like names that are rarer in a given distribution. Let's say somehow they have access to like, some statistics about names that occur in like higher education in the Western world or something like that. So they're just willing to like, the cost of like just attacking 1,000 names might be sufficiently low that like if they get, a one or two hits, it's worth it.
Right. Yeah. That's an excellent point. And I think it relates. We're using transformers and some of this modern technology to de-identify writing, but that could also be used to re-identify
Right.
students theoretically. And so it's maybe a bit of an arms race going on. So yeah, how does the attack surface change with this technology? I think it's broadened, and I hope that we can use more sophisticated methods to obfuscate that will hopefully keep pace with these information retrieval methods. It's difficult to imagine a situation where there's significant value in a concerted effort to extract one or two identities out of 1,000. You can imagine situations where maybe advertisers want data. And I don't think they're going to be that interested in that sort of situation. Or you can imagine maybe even more concerning scenarios where somebody has a stalker or they're in the witness protection program or something. And that's where someone wants a very specific identity. So this idea of getting 1 in 100 through a very sophisticated method doesn't seem like a major risk to me, but maybe there's some scenario I'm not thinking of. And I don't know if that answers your question. It's a good thought, Rich.
No, yeah, it does definitely. I mean, it's definitely an extremely costly method for, not too much there's not too much bang for your buck in that, right? You're still ultimately brute forcing for orders of magnitude less results, and like, how useful is it to get one name out of 1,000 is or even fewer than that. It's definitely a good point.
Yeah. But you're right. That would be theoretically a way to defeat the hiding in plain sight obfuscation strategy. Would just be to exhaustively try all of them and see what information you can pull out. And that's more plausible as technology improves.
Yeah, one interesting thing is, I know like from my history working with ALOE in the past, um, one of the challenges is like how do you get meaningful statistics about this kind of data? So like you were saying, like, luckily there was this, I mean, from some perspectives, obviously there was issues with the fact that Facebook, had leaked a lot of those names and things, but for work like this, it's actually very advantageous, and you get to build methods like this. One of the interesting things is, I think this relates to like the transfer question earlier, is how do you keep the identifiers and the obfuscators updated in the face of a shifting distribution of like student identity? And I think there it's like actually really this is more of maybe like an operational or like a distribution question, but like there it makes a lot of sense to partner with a lot of educational institutions that have their own internal security methods around this data and privacy protection. But you can basically get statistics around these and dynamically probably update a lot of these methods. So you can sort of, I guess, like my point here is that what's interesting is that there is a tap into the ability to continue to profile these shifting distributions to be able to continue to update these approaches. So you don't necessarily, going forward, need continual leaks of data sets like that to be able to update these approaches.
Yeah, that's a great thought. It also makes me wonder if that could dovetail nicely with using generative AI to create the surrogate identifiers. These models presumably are trained on a lot of data. Some of it's private, and there's new ones every couple of months.
Right.
So they might just inherently reflect a current distribution of names, for example. That'd be interesting. And the real reason to use them is that generating an appropriate name is not just a function of the most likely gender and nationality for that name.
Right.
Names, other context might make one name more or less appropriate or more or less obvious as a surrogate. And generative AI should theoretically be able to perform much better in that respect. At least to a human reader, it would look more natural in more cases. But that also relates to the argument about how likely a name is, because I think generative AI would tend to produce more likely names, and then you would have a pretty stark difference. I think if you saw a rare name, you'd be pretty sure that wasn't a surrogate. So figuring out how to, I don't know, convince the AI or maybe use a combination of the approaches.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool.
Great questions.
Excellent. Well, if there are no further questions, Langdon, how can people learn more about your work?
Oh, absolutely. Well, you already shared my website, and were a few publications that were cited in the presentation. If you like, I'd be happy to send those out. I think the pillow paper is a good place to start. And the Kaggle competition page is still live. And you can find our lab at learlab.org if you're interested in some of the other work we do.
Excellent. Awesome. And all links will be shared in our Discord later on. Manifold is a new kind of research lab. We're trying to build out high leverage science and technology breakthroughs. If you guys like this event and you want to find out more about us, go ahead and visit our website at manifoldrg.com. Links for that will also be included. Thank you guys so much for attending today for our second Frontiers talk. Thank you, Langdon, for this excellent talk. And the recording will be available later.
Thanks, Langdon. We'll have to have you again sometime soon.
Yes,
Thank you.
Langdon.
Happy to.
Awesome. Take care. Thanks.